Welcome to The New Paradigm for Mankind, a weekly discussion between Lyndon LaRouche and his scientific associates, in which we investigate the true nature of the creative human mind and the ideas necessary for the progress of mankind.
Today we're going to continue the discussion on the needed concepts to address the breakdown of this current system. And Cody's going to open it up for us today with, I think, some useful discussion on the difference between what will be a form of insanity in terms of responding to the crisis conditions being imposed upon us by the breakdown of the system versus bringing forward a new positive concept of what is the future that mankind needs to create to actually transcend this breakdown, and where we find the scientific basis, the principles underlying this needed future mankind must create. And so with that, I think Cody's ready to open it up and bring us the discussion here.
Yeah, so what we want to do is start to dispel some of these myths about the way economies work and the responses to the crisis. I think first off, it's important to note that from the standpoint of the oligarchical perspective, the collapse of the system is an intended effect. I mean, they've always had the intention to bring about massive reductions in population, reductions in living standard, and go back to a feudal type of order. And they've created a system that would produce exactly that kind of effect. Now, many of the axioms that they've introduced have been accepted by their dupes, who are willing to act really as abiding Nazis in pushing through these policies. But unfortunately, much of the general population has also come to accept a number of these axioms and are willing to accept the kinds of consequences that unfold from these axioms. And we're talking about the kind of discussion now going on with austerity, massive budget cuts, where the discussion is, well, we don't have enough to go around. Mm-hmm. People are getting older. They're drawing more on the resources. And since we all accept that there are limits to growth, there are limits to resources, well, we're just going to have to go through with these necessary kinds of cuts. And so now it's reached the point of insanity where you've got even Democrats going along with the president explicitly on the idea that we now have to start to cut major entitlements like Social Security, like Medicaid and Medicare, all in the name of balancing the budget. And that though we may not like it, it's unavoidable. That's the idea that's pushed. Now, we saw this expressed by a guy who is not a fool, but really is malicious. And I'm talking about Frank Keating, the head of the American Bankers Association, who has been an outspoken opponent of a return to Glass-Steagall, who in fact has had some of his goons directly attack our own members, Paul Gallagher in particular, attacking him and his call for Glass-Steagall in, I forget which paper it was. Was it in South Dakota, I believe it was? Mm-hmm. Anyway, so you've got Keating, head of the American Bankers Association, speaking as a mouthpiece really for J.P. Morgan and the oligarchical interests, who are saying we have to try to salvage and hold on to our financial system at all cost. And if that means millions of people have to be thrown to the scrap heap, so be it. That's just the way the world is. And so you got an expression of this. Let's read one quote from Keating. This is about 2 weeks ago at a hearing of the U.S. Senate Banking Committee in discussing the fact that, and you'll see what he says, about how we have to deal with the fact that the baby boomer generation is the largest generation in population size and is now getting older and is becoming more of a burden on the resources of the planet. So here's what Keating says. He says, in 1950, the average person retired at 62 and died at 69 or 65 or 69. Today, the average person retires at 62 and dies at 80. So all the actuarial tables are off. we are mercifully living a lot longer, which is causing huge stresses in our ability to provide for the elderly in the United States. And it will continue to deepen and darken over the course of the next 20 years. And so making that argument, he then says we need to go towards these things like longevity indexes, where effectively you're doing accounting analysis on the lives of people, saying, can we really afford to keep people alive as long as they are? Isn't there a limit in terms of how old people should be allowed to get while they consume resources and no longer contribute to the economy, to the GDP? And it's a fascist mentality. It is exactly the idea of certain lives are not worthy to be lived. It's the same kind of mentality which is behind Obamacare, where they start to put in these regulations. Yes, we're going to, quote unquote, expand health care to everybody, but we're going to expand it more to the effect of creating a control over the lives of our population, where we start putting in restrictions on what kind of health care you're going to get. We start putting restrictions on what kind of treatments you're entitled to get based off of what your monetary return to the economy. So it's really fascist accounting. And that's what we're seeing really starting to dominate the discussion in Washington. You know, this whole fake debate between the Democrats and the Republicans really is vectored towards one end, which is start to reduce the population of the United States en masse through massive cuts in those, really the social safety net that was set up by the likes of Franklin Roosevelt and was defended by John Kennedy, really the last president to wholly defend these kinds of measures. Now, it's really an absurd idea, because if you look at the history of mankind, that's been the trend always. We're always living longer. We're always increasing the living standard, increasing the population density. That's the nature of human growth. And so at any point, with this kind of mentality, you could have stepped in and said, oh, we've got to cut it off. People are now living to be 50 years of age. That's much, much too old, right? Your usefulness to society ends at whatever, 35, when you can no longer run down an ox or something like that. So you could have, with this mentality, always said, oh, now here's where we need to cut it off. Right? Cost-benefit analysis says that we can't support people over the age of 45. Or women, once they've given birth to their third child, let them die because they're no longer a use to the tribe or something. And so it's really been, it's an insane idea. So if you look here, this just shows you population growth in Europe. What's actually been the trend? Well, we've always had growth, and really you had an explosion in population density, and life expectancy, really coming out of the Renaissance period, which should start to give you an indication of what really is behind human economic growth. That human economic growth is not simply a function of resources or anything physical in that sense, but it's a function of the creative powers of the human mind. And so at the Renaissance, when you had an explosion of science, an explosion of culture, new ideas being introduced about the nature of the nation state itself, with figures such as Nicholas of Cusa, right? You see those kinds of ideas are what actually drive this kind of growth. And this is actually a natural process. But of course, at any point along here, with this kind of oligarchical mentality, and they did do this, you could have always stepped in and said, oh, now we've reached the limit. Now, the inverse of this is what happens whenever we fail to introduce higher forms of energy flux density. Whenever we actually go along with a kind of oligarchical system, the monetarist system that we've had of late. And so here what you see, this is what's known as the triple curve collapse function that Mr. LaRouche had developed, 20 plus years ago or so, right? Where you're looking at so you've got this dynamic between these three different curves: the physical economy, financial aggregates, and then the money supply, where you see an inverse relationship between the hyperbolic growth of the financial side of things really feeding off the hyperbolic collapse of the physical side of things. And this gives you an image of really where we've reached now, where we've seen a systematic collapse of our physical economy. Right? We've failed to invest in the right forms of industry or technology, while we've had this massive explosion in finance, in monetary output, typified now by the insanity of QE infinity, or whatever they're dealing with now. Well, here you see the changes in the type of the share of the workforce in different sectors. So you see, going back to 1950s, we had about 30% of our workforce was in manufacturing. That's now collapsed down to just over 10%. And it's actually much less heavy industry types of manufacturing even than what's depicted here. Meanwhile, look at where the growth has been. It's been in things like services. It's been in things like finance. So while you've had a growth in finance, a growth in so-called monetary growth, you've had a collapse in physical growth. You see that here. Here's another curve you see from 39 to 09. Here you see the blue line. This is goods producing employment. So it's been pretty much steady. So we've got about the same number of people producing things while the population has been growing. Meanwhile, you look at the services providing. That's what's been growing, services, a service-based economy. Here you look again at the size, sector size in terms of GDP. Back in the 1960s or so, you had near 30% of our GDP was a function of manufacturing, where only a small percent, just about 10, came from finance, insurance, real estate, etc. But you look at the trend. You've had a hyperbolic growth in finance in terms of percentage of GDP and a total collapse in manufacturing. And so you see, we're no longer a productive economy, which is why it's necessary that we take up exactly the kind of policy we've been calling for, this Pacific orientation. Because while we've been collapsing, much of the slack, which has been able to even just maintain even the veneer of some quality of life in this country, has been a function of the fact that we've basically been depending on cheap labor in places like Asia, in China. It's been projected that just in the last 10 years, we've probably lost over 2 million manufacturing jobs to China. Now, of course, they themselves cannot sustain their current level of growth because they've become then dependent on the U.S. and others to be sort of, as Mr. LaRouche put it at one point, the consumer of last resort. Well, now we're no longer going to be able to consume these goods. They're not going to be able to sustain their level of growth under the current paradigm. But because of this shift, it means that we must necessarily move towards this kind of strategic alliance, where we start to develop and utilize the industrial capacity that has been developed in Asia, and to bring it together with certain know-how and advantages of the United States to really take on this whole development of the Pacific Rim. Developing things like the NAWAPA system here in the United States, developing the Bering Strait corridor into Asia, and actually having an alliance for that kind of development, where we necessarily need each other now, but we need each other according to this perspective of real high-intensity, higher energy flux density type of growth. And I think we'll be able to make the case over the next weeks or more that the only thing that is going to work with this is to go with a fusion-based driver economy. That we have to, in a sense, leapfrog the 40, 50 years of collapse. That we can't even fission itself isn't going to be sufficient. We're going to have to leapfrog it towards fusion, being driven by fusion in order to have a rate of accelerated growth that can overcome the rate of accelerated collapse that we've seen over the last 50 years. And so that's really the perspective we've got to have. And, as we've discussed, starts with Glass-Steagall, you get that in, you set up the firewall, you go back to this kind of Hamiltonian system of credit, driven by this idea of the Asian or the Pacific orientation, fusion development. That's your orientation. Now you start to develop the credit to be put out to actually facilitate the flow of resources, manpower, etc., into that kind of real physical growth process. So let's leave it at that and see what we have here for discussion.
Well, first of all, I would say we've got to avoid assuming the people's argument today. They fail to understand the fundamental difference between mankind and other forms of life, first of all. Now, this became clear with the Nicholas of Cusa's program, which was actually introduced into practice in the transatlantic region. So this thing, which was actually initiated and designed by Cusa, after he was dead, you had Christopher Columbus came along, was instructed on the basis of Cusa's teachings. And that led to a change in the Americas, specifically in North America especially, in which we broke free of the oligarchical system. Now, the thing to understand here is you can't talk about what people simply say that one system, like a European system and an American system, are somehow the same thing. They're not. The changes that come in Europe came in the form of the influence of the American discovery. Otherwise, Europe was going back through the same old that had been going through in terms of destruction ever since. So it was the actual development of the United States, which was a part of this whole process, but initiated by the Cusa's impetus. Now, that's where the problem lies. The problem is not anything inherent in physical economy as such. It's entirely located in the question of the mind of mankind. First of all, the animal world, which includes shall we say, Obama, he belongs to the animal world, not to the human world. We had a society which was largely based on the animal world, the oligarchical system. And we're living today under an oligarchical system, not an American system.
Right.
And what you have is the intention here is to reduce the population for what reason? To kill them. To reduce the quantity. What's the Queen of England doing? She is specifying a reduction of the human population from 7 billion persons to a rapid decline into 1 billion persons. And that's mainly for the Earth. So all these things have nothing to do with practical considerations. They're purely ideological considerations. What is dominating the United States, and particularly Wall Street, is purely ideological. It's a reflection of that system, the oligarchical system. This is no longer our Constitution. Our Constitution has been destroyed in practice by this process. There was never any practical reason in terms of economics for what has happened. Right. It's purely rape. And it's the intention to prevent the human species from existing as a human species. They're trying to reduce the human species to an animal species. Now, the difference of the human species is energy flux density. Since the existence of mankind, the natural tendency has been to increase the energy flux density of human practice. And this can be measured in terms of South Africa, where you had this ancient time, you had the use of fire by mankind distinguished the human species from the non-human species. And what is happening now, again, is the oligarchical system is typified by the Dutch and British empires. These are entirely anti-human systems. They want to rule the planet as animals. Right. And therefore they have to reduce the population in numbers in order to reduce them to the scale of an animal species, not a human species. So the issue is not actually economic. It is murder, an intentional mass murder of the human population as an inhuman species, to reduce the human species to an inhuman species. So it's a malicious intention. And you can go through the entirety of history, and you can measure the progress of man by looking at the rate of energy flux density. Now you take the increase of energy flux density per capita in human beings, and you take the ebb and flow of that tendency, which accounts for the degeneration of Eurasia. That Eurasia has gone through these long periods of mass death. Why? Because they have been following an oligarchical system. There's somewhere in this process, as in the Americas and in Europe, something went wrong. A human species, which was naturally species, and we know this stuff from the records, even although it's marginal at the beginning, that the human species was always, when it was a human species, actually, was not oligarchical. Somewhere in this process, the oligarchical principle became dominant in controlling the fate of mankind. The greatest improvement that ever occurred over this was the result of what Cousin discovered. And it was Cousin who specified crossing the great oceans into other continents away from the Eurasian continent and going to this new continent, this new freshly discovered continent. It wasn't actually totally fresh, but that was the effect. This made the change. The creation of the United States was the most decisive action that was ever taken against the oligarchical system. Now, the unfortunate part about it was the Anglo-Dutch system, which was an oligarchical system, not a human system. And that distinction should be made. When you're talking about the British system, for example, you're talking about the oligarchical system, not the human system.
And the responses to the crisis. I think first off, it's important to note that from the standpoint of the oligarchical perspective, the collapse of the system is an intended effect. I mean, they've always had the intention to bring about massive reductions in population, reductions in living standard, and go back to a feudal type of order. And they've created a system that would produce exactly that kind of effect. Now, many of the axioms that they've introduced have been accepted by their dupes, who are willing to act really as abiding Nazis in pushing through these policies. But unfortunately, much of the general population has also come to accept a number of these axioms and are willing to accept the kinds of consequences that unfold from these axioms. Welcome to The New Paradigm for Mankind, a weekly discussion between Lyndon LaRouche and his scientific associates, in which we investigate the true nature of the creative human mind and the ideas necessary for the progress of mankind.
Is bringing forward a new positive concept of what is the future that mankind needs to create to actually transcend this breakdown, and where we find the scientific basis, the principles underlying this needed future mankind must create. And so with that, I think Cody's ready to open it up and bring us the discussion here.
Yeah, so what we want to do is start to dispel some of these myths about the way economies work.
Today we're going to continue the discussion on the needed concepts to address the breakdown of this current system. And Cody's going to open it up for us today with, I think, some useful discussion on the difference between what will be a form of insanity in terms of responding to the crisis conditions being imposed upon us by the breakdown of the system versus